Are you struggling with strategy? Are you, your team, or other people that you know or work with struggling with strategy today? If so, you're not alone. Many people struggle with strategy, but often do so in silence. According to Professor Richard Rumelt, who has been teaching strategy since the 1960s, good strategy is the exception, not the rule, and the problem's growing. Richard made these points in his 2011 book, Good Strategy, Bad Strategy, which lays bare the problems of bad strategies. I heard Richard speak about this issue at a conference over a decade ago, and his insights are one of the reasons that I started developing better ways to create and implement strategy in the organizations I work with. Back then, whilst I'd worked in organizations with great strategies, I'd also worked for a few where the development or implementation of the strategy faced significant challenges. Those situations didn't always turn out so well for the organizations in question, and they were pretty detrimental to my career. Bad strategies, in my experience, often play out over a long period of time, which can be stressful for everyone involved. What does bad strategy or bad strategy implementation cost you or your organization? What is currently at risk if your strategy does not work out and misses the mark? I now help leaders and their organizations who are struggling with strategy to avoid the mistakes I learned the hard way. I do that using a model-based framework which guides you through the process to identify and organize all of the relevant information that you need to develop, communicate, and implement your strategy. You can find out more information about this framework in the links below. This struggle with strategy often manifests itself in a number of ways and can lead to a range of detrimental behaviors, including the collective avoidance of acknowledging that a problem exists at all. In 2015, the Harvard Business Review published an article based on a large-scale study, which found that 2/3 to 3/4 of large organizations struggle to implement their strategies. The researchers concluded that executional excellence is the number one challenge. Then there's this book, Fit for Growth, published in 2016, which also drew from a large-scale study and found that 50% of executives did not think they had a winning strategy, 90% thought they were missing major opportunities in the market, 80% believed their strategy was not well understood, even in their own companies. And then there's this Sloan Management Review study that focused on one particular technology organization. In this organization, the strategy had been in place for 2 years, but implementation was not going well. When they surveyed the staff, 97% reported having a clear understanding of the company's 5 strategic priorities and how their work contributed to the corporate objectives. However, when the researchers dug a little deeper, 1/3 of the leaders charged with implementing the company's strategy could not list even one of the 5 strategic priorities. In the 2015 Harvard Business Review article, Why Strategy Execution Unravels and What to Do About It, researchers from MIT highlighted the risks to strategy execution by not achieving what they term horizontal coordination across the different functions within an organization, in addition to the vertical alignment issues. The researchers found that, in the manager's minds, execution equals alignment. So a failure to execute implies a breakdown in the process to link strategy to action at every level in the organization. However, the research also found that fully 84% of managers say they can rely on their boss and their direct reports all or most of the time, a finding that sheds little light on why execution fails. But when the researchers asked about commitments across functions and business units, the answer became a little more clear. Only 9% of managers say they can rely on colleagues in other functions and units all of the time, and only half say they can rely on them most of the time. Commitments from these colleagues are typically no more reliable than those made by external partners, such as distributors and suppliers. The researchers concluded that when managers cannot rely on colleagues in other functions and units, they compensate with a host of dysfunctional behaviors that undermine execution. And my final example comes from the 2018 book, Thinking the Unthinkable. A few years ago, I met the authors Nick Gowring and Chris Langdon. Nick, a seasoned BBC News anchor, and Chris, a TV producer and director of a think tank. Over several years, they interviewed hundreds of senior leaders in government, business, major institutions, and non-governmental organisations. Whilst most interviewees asked to remain off the record, The interviews were often recorded by agreement, which has allowed Nick and Chris to include detailed first-hand notes into their book. What Nick and Chris uncovered was the extent to which many leaders were struggling with the disruptive changes unfolding in their organisations, industries and sectors. All confided that they're enduring significant difficulties in leading their organisations through periods which are now frequently described using terms such as VUCA, which stands for volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous. Many of those interviewed asked, "What are the solutions? Do you have a framework for me?" But Nick and Chris's response at the time was, "We don't believe there are any neat, easily defined solutions." The main conclusion Nick and Chris came to in the book was this: the conformity which gets leaders to the top disqualifies many of them from gripping the scale of disruption and knowing what to do about it. Whilst these personal first-hand accounts into the nature and problems that leaders are facing are enlightening, I didn't fully agree with the conclusion that the experience of these leaders throughout their career disqualifies them from dealing with the situation. I knew, and I had experience with some other existing approaches that can help re-equip leaders with the skills necessary to tackle such problems. And I was also working on my own framework to address this issue at the time. If you ran a similar set of research studies in your own organisation, what would the results be? At what part of the strategy, development, communication or implementation process do your issues lie? The overall conclusion the authors of Fit for Growth came to is that strategy is broken and that there's a strategy to execution gap. But is it really broken, or is it just not easy to learn and practice? Roger Martin, another leading strategy thinker, practitioner and author, wrote in an article in 2024 that strategy is a lost art. I believe that Roger's characterization of the issue goes a long way to explaining why many leaders are looking for solutions. So now I'll share a few insights that have helped me develop a model-based framework to address this strategy as a lost art problem. Firstly, there is an issue of which tools or frameworks you should use. Over the last few decades, I've read hundreds of books on strategy and adjacent disciplines involved in its implementation. Some books are helpful, packed with original insights, whereas many are just often incremental improvements or a different perspective on previously explored ideas. To give you a sense of how many tools and frameworks are out there, in the book Your Strategy Needs a Strategy, published in 2016, the authors reviewed all of the strategy tools and frameworks developed since the 1960s. They concluded that around 80 significant frameworks had been created during that period, which they represented in this diagram. As I read more books and applied their insights, I started to realize that whilst there's considerable breadth and depth to the tools and frameworks, there's also significant gaps and overlaps, which are often not called out by the various authors. Many of the concepts in these books are fairly straightforward to understand. You don't need to have gained an MBA or work for a top-tier consulting firm to grasp these concepts. Pretty much anyone can be taught them if they're broken down and explained in a straightforward way. Having found some relevant tools and frameworks, the next challenge is how to use them. That challenge is often about how to organize and combine these tools and frameworks and the insights that come out of them to help you create, communicate, and implement your strategy. Another reason strategy can seem complicated is that it can involve quite a few steps, which are often iterative. However, with the right framework to guide you, those steps can be learned and applied by most people. So, what are some of the other insights that led to my model-based approach? Many tools and frameworks from different authors can complement each other, which is not often apparent until they are used in practice, as authors of different tools and frameworks don't usually highlight the similarities between their works. Instead, they often confuse matters further by the way that they label their tools and don't give clear reasons behind their choices as to why some factors are included but others are left out. It's often the logical gaps in tools which trip people up. Fortunately, I'd seen a similar problem with managing information before, and therefore I saw a possible path to a solution. Many years ago I worked for Google, and they had a simple, clear mission statement: to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. What I recognize is that the field of strategy needs a better way to organize all these tools and frameworks and make them universally accessible and useful. This led me to developing a model-based strategy framework. This framework is not just another attempt to solve one part of the strategy puzzle, or create yet another tool to provide a slightly different perspective. Instead, it's a way of organizing, selecting, combining, and representing the concepts and insights from all the existing strategy tools and frameworks that are relevant to your needs. This model-based framework also fills in the logical gaps which I found exist by using a few new diagrams, which are easy to grasp. And it also includes a more prominent way of representing time, which is often missing or implicit in many of the existing tools and frameworks. But increasingly, time is more of a factor you need to consider. So why do I believe that a model-based approach will improve the way we learn and practice strategy? Other disciplines have already figured out that models are the way to go to manage complex systems, such as systems architecture, engineering, and enterprise architecture, which I've also studied and practiced. In his 2024 book, The 6 Disciplines of Strategic Thinking, Michael Watkins, who has sold over 1 million copies of his previous management books, also provides support for a model-based approach when he wrote, "By one estimate, 95% of the world's population cannot think in terms of systems because they are so used to using simple cause and effect chains to solve problems. To solve complex problems, you need to invest in building the best possible model of systems." It's my view, and that of others, that the practice of strategy and all the disciplines involved in implementing it will increasingly depend on the development and maintenance of an up-to-date, holistic model of your organization and the environments in which it operates over time. Such models will help provide relevant context to feed into AI tools, which themselves will then help you manage and develop your strategy and its implementation. However, to use, understand, and trust such tools, I believe that leaders will need to understand the fundamentals of strategy to a greater degree, which is what I provide through the use of my model-based framework. So what does a model-based framework look like in practice? This is an image of the single-page guide that I currently use to take people through the framework, which you can download from the link below. The guide is used as a checklist to rapidly help you assess your business at a high level, filling out relevant information on a set of model boards which are currently available to my clients. After an initial pass through the framework, it quickly becomes more clear which aspects of your organization and the environments in which it operates require greater analysis and focus in subsequent iterations. I can then guide you or your team through the next level of analysis by introducing other relevant tools and insights from a library of assets that I've built up over many years. So if you or somebody you know are struggling with strategy right now and as a result are facing significant risk or direct loss, and you need to rapidly find a solution to that problem, then please reach out to me for a conversation to find out how this model-based framework can help you.